Volition's closing earlier this year marked the end of an era. While the makers of Descent and Rent Faction failed to capture audiences with their latest titles, there was a time where they were at a peak. I would argue that this was 2011, with their release of Saints Row the Third. This game was my introduction to the series, and likely my favorite, or at least it was until I played the remaster. Saints Row the Third Remastered is different than the original. While this is mainly restricted to visuals and some world elements, what hasn't changed is the way the story is presented. Unfortunately, this is where the remaster is worse than the original. Significant events are told through cutscenes, which are used sparingly, perhaps a little too sparingly for my liking. Mission information and details are delivered through phone calls, which are a refreshingly non-intrusive way to relay less important information. However, where the problem lies is with the verbal communication that can occur during missions. The direction-based audio they added in the remaster makes conversations awkward. If you face away or get far enough away from your companion, the audio can cut off or be super quiet. This means that you can miss callouts, character motivations, or mission details. Luckily, this is the largest failing of Remastered's aesthetics. I do remember the original Saints Row looking okay, but the Remastered has enhanced the visuals to a fairly impressive standard. There are plenty of great looking locations, which unfortunately can be difficult to find again as they aren't typically marked as locations on the map. I also like the changes they made to the characters. They are more realistic looking and have added detail to the faces and have improved the art style overall. The audio is also pretty good when it's working properly. There is a fairly good selection of licensed music on the radio and in key moments. The menu and store music is okay, but the store music can be awkward and cause conflicts with the store's regular music. Guns aren't anything spectacular, but at least the voice acting is good when you can hear it. Gameplay has aged decently and handles fairly well, whether you use a controller or mouse and keyboard. There are a lot of activities to do, though most of them just entail either fighting things or blowing things up. While weapons and melee mostly feel good, I'll admit I was getting a bit fed up with how repetitive everything was getting. Despite this, there have been some modifications to how vehicles handle, making them feel faster and better than the original. It almost makes me wish they had added some sort of racing activity, but considering how much of your time is traveling from A to B, this might get tiresome too. Speaking of traveling, I noticed that AI drivers are significantly worse in Remastered than the original. I want to say that this is intentional to adhere to a reference mentioned in Genki Bowl, but it does make for a little bit annoying if comedic moments when vehicles randomly explode. I also think the rendering is longer distance than the original, but it feels a little more jarring, closer to it did in Saints Row 4. Overall, I think the world feels a little less real, or at least a little less lived in than the original Saints Row the Third. Once again, much like Saints Row 4, which at least had the excuse of being set in a simulation. Unfortunately, there has been no improvements to accessibility. There are subtitles, thankfully, but there is no in-game way to change either the spoken or subtitle language. There are different difficulty options and you can change key bindings, though this is limited to mouse and keyboard. Fortunately, Remastered fares fairly well in convenience, as it's available physically on Xbox One, Series, PlayStation 4, and 5, and it's also available digitally on GOG, Steam, and Epic Game Store. If you include the original game, it's also available on PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Switch. The settings menus aren't the best, but there are a lot of options and settings that should allow for most users to play it. I did find a few bugs, one being the AI cars crashing, as I'm not totally convinced that it's an intended feature. I also encountered a couple of crashes, one of which let me continue to play until I hit a loading boundary. I already mentioned the issues with the directional audio, but I also had a phone call or two that cut off as soon as I entered the vehicle, as well as conversations suddenly stopping when I left a particular area in a mission. There was also a time on one of the radio stations where no music was playing at all, and I don't know if this is a bug or the fact that the license ended. And then of course we do have the clashing audio in the stores with the store music and the store menu music being a little awkward at times. However, I would say that the overall experience of the game is good. The combat feels good even if it is at sometimes silly and repetitive. The story and characters are at times wacky and entertaining, but I can't say I enjoyed any particular element as much as I did when I played the original, perhaps except the driving, which feels really good when the AR aren't being stupid. I can't say I enjoyed how they presented the story either, but I do think that the original does a better job since it doesn't have the audio issues I mentioned. While I still liked the game and had fun the majority of the time I was playing it, I do think that this version is mostly worse than the original. It's kind of hard to say exactly how I feel on the issue, but I think that the game design hasn't aged particularly well, even if you ignore the issues that I came across. Ultimately, I think I have to place it as a meh on the A scale. When comparing it to a game that I don't have rose-tinted glasses for, such as Duke Nukem Forever, I do think that it's better, but it also has more issues. I'm not entirely sure that those issues are in the original, and while I might get around to reviewing it in my In the Rough series, I'm not entirely convinced that that score will be much better, if it is better at all. But let me know what you think about Saints Row the Third and Saints Row Remastered in the comments below, and check out my Operation Flashpoint review, and I will see you there.